Now we're going to talk about some things that you may never have heard of, and honestly, until I took this class, didn't know were a thing, and that is fluid in your brain. I know, isn't fluid in your brain bad? It's in the wrong place. So the ventricles are these pockets of cerebrospinal fluid that are located within the brain itself, and then they're connected to a central canal that goes down through the spinal cord. So there are 4 ventricles inside the brain, and the top 2 are the largest 2 are called the lateral ventricles. They sit laterally. There is a septum here that divides them, that's right below the corpus callosum. So they kind of sit laterally to this corpus callosum. Then those are connected to a third ventricle. Yes, I know. Where are the first 2? 1 and 2. I have no idea which is supposed to be 1 and which is supposed to be 2. We just call them the lateral ventricles now. So lateral ventricle is connected to a third ventricle. Then there's this little connection called the cerebral aqueduct, which connects to the cleverly named fourth ventricle, which drains into the central canal of the spinal cord. So this is what they look like from the front. This is what they look like from the side. Okay, and you can see that the third ventricle is here. Okay, it is in the center, and then here's the cerebral aqueduct. Looks a little more like an aqueduct or a narrow passageway for water when you see it from the side. Okay, so what is this fluid inside the ventricles? It's cerebrospinal fluid, and we talked about it briefly when we talked about the glial cells in chapter 14. Remember the glial cells, one of the glial cells one of the types is ependymal cells, and they make cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is much like blood plasma, but it's blood plasma that's been filtered to fill these spaces in the brain and to surround the brain. It's clear, it's colorless, it's mostly water with ions and some small proteins and nutrients in it. The brain actually floats in cerebral spinal fluid, not from these, but from the subarachnoid space, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which goes all around the brain. Because that buoys and makes the brain float, the brain doesn't bruise itself by its own weight pressing against the bones of the skull. How cool is that? So it also cushions the brain during sudden movements. So if if you stop really fast, your brain doesn't bruise itself against the skull again. And it transports nutrients and chemicals to the brain and then removes waste. Now, remember that we also have a blood supply going through the brain that is also going to bring nutrients and chemicals to the brain. Okay, remember we do have the astrocytes surrounding the capillaries in the brain. Okay, so there's 2 things going on. We have the blood supply through the brain, which is bringing nutrients and oxygen and taking away carbon dioxide and waste. And we also have the cerebrospinal fluid, okay, which is mostly either in the ventricles or around the brain. The cerebrospinal fluid is formed by a choroid plexus, which is made up of ependymal cells, and those are present in each of the ventricles, in each of the ventricles. So this is a coronal section through the brain, okay, and we're looking at this area right here. So here's the corpus callosum, there's the longitudinal fissure, and then on either side under the corpus callosum is the lateral ventricles, and there's a choroid plexus, which just looks like a pile of goo, honestly. And then were this a live brain, this area would be full of cerebrospinal fluid. If we zoom in on this, now this is obviously just a diagram, but we can see that there's a capillary, and then around the capillary are the ependymal cells, and they are filtering the blood plasma that's exiting that capillary, making sure that only the things that should be in the ventricle are getting out of the capillary, okay? So they're going to do this extra layer of filtration. All right, so now let's talk about how the cerebrospinal fluid circulates around and through the brain. So it starts off, it's made by choroid plexus made up of ependymal cells inside the ventricle. This diagram is going to start with the lateral ventricle here at number 1. Okay, now remember we also have the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle here. This is the fourth ventricle. Okay, this is just going to talk about number 1. It goes from lateral ventricles through the third ventricle, and then through the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. Okay, from the fourth ventricle, there's 2 ways that it can go. It can flow into the subarachnoid space here and go all the way all around the brain, separating to cushion between the brain and the skull. Or it can go down through in the subarachnoid space, down through around the spinal cord as well. Or from the fourth ventricle, it can flow here into the central canal that goes down in the middle of the spinal cord. Okay, so from the fourth ventricle, 2 openings, one to the subarachnoid space, goes around the brain and around the spinal cord, and the other that goes down to the central canal that goes down through the middle of the spinal cord. Okay, all of these things, the central canal and the subarachnoid space and the ventricles, all filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Then from the subarachnoid space, it's going to pick up waste and products from the brain, and then it's going to flow into the sagittal sinus, and that's how it's going to drain out of the brain. So it goes into the brain space through the choroid plexus in the ventricle, and then it's going to flow out into the venous sinus. So within the venous sinus, we have, here we go, these little openings in the dura mater. Okay, so we have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater. This is the subarachnoid space filled with the cerebrospinal fluid, held up and with the arachnoid trabeculae. There's these openings in the dura mater and little bits of the arachnoid mater that kind of mushroom up into the venous sinus. This is called an arachnoid villus, like in the intestine, and they have trabeculae to keep them open. And from here, the cerebrospinal fluid is going to diffuse out into this venous sinus. So then in the venous sinus, we have venous blood and cerebrospinal fluid. And so that excess blood plasma that became the cerebrospinal fluid then flows back into the blood and goes back to being blood plasma. Okay, so from the ventricle through the subarachnoid space or through the central canal, and then from the central canal, it's going to flow back up and then make it into the subarachnoid space, and then from the subarachnoid space out through these little arachnoid villi into the venous sinus, and then back into the venous circulatory system. Now, again, remember that this is not the blood circulation through the brain. That is made up of just regular arteries, veins, capillaries, and especially the capillaries are wrapped in these perivascular feet of the astrocytes, which are making the blood-brain barrier. And that is that. And our next part is going to be the biggest, the cranial nerve. Stay tuned.